We are in the middle of our series, What's Love Got to Do with It? And we've been navigating through, launching off from 1 Corinthians 13, right? We've read this each week, and I think it's a good just kind of reminder to keep ahead of us and in front of us. What Paul says about love, that love is patient and kind. It doesn't envy or boast. It isn't arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So this week, each week, we've been looking at a different element of what love is and what love has to do with it. And I hope that by the end of this series, we'll just come to that spot where we can all say, what's love got to do with it? Everything. It has everything to do with everything. It has everything to do with how we walk and navigate through life. It has everything to do with what it means to be a Jesus follower is love. That's what Jesus taught. And so we've been launching off of that into look at Jesus. But today the phrase we're going to dig into is this one. It does not insist on its own way. Love doesn't insist on its own way. Different translations say it like this: love is not self-seeking. Another translation says it does not demand its own way. The NASB says it does not seek its own behalf. Another translation says it's not selfish. Maybe the more modern way we can say it, Eugene Peterson captured it in the Message. It says, love isn't always me first. I like that. Love isn't always me first. So what we're talking about is this big picture. Love is others first. Love is others first. Keep in mind that as we navigate through this 1 Corinthians passage, Paul is writing to a church in a church setting where a lot of selfishness was taking place. If you look through and have read through 1 Corinthians, which if you've been journeying through in our discipleship groups, last week we read through 1 Corinthians, and if you, like our group on last Sunday night, we just talked through 1 Corinthians, and man, there was some issues happening in the church in Corinth at this time, and a lot of them stemmed from the core of selfishness. We look at in chapter 6, right? In chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians, we see that the church, everyone was, they were dragging each other into court so that they could get what they thought they deserved. And so Paul reminds them, hey, listen, let's not be Jesus followers who drag other followers of Jesus into court so that we can sue them for what we think we deserve. In chapter 10, we saw them eating meats offered to idols and sacrificed to idols with absolutely no regard for what it would do for the weaker brother, for somebody that couldn't handle it. And they were like, some of the people couldn't handle that, like that other people were eating meat sacrificed to idols, and they're like, oh, forget you, just get along with the times, right? In chapter 11, they ate what they were called fellowship meals. In other words, on days they would gather together to eat meals together. Everybody was me first during the mood. I want to be first in line. I want to get the most. I want to have that, right? There was this selfish every man for himself. In chapter 12, we saw how they even took spiritual gifts and they used spiritual gifts as an opportunity to say, look at me, I'm better. My gifts are better. Look at me, I'm more important to the church than everybody else. Look at me based upon the gifts that God had given them. We just see this over and over through 1 Corinthians that the Christians there in the church seem to be motivated by selfishness. And that's really not surprising, because if we look at the church in Corinth, what they had allowed is that the world's influence had kind of infiltrated into, and they allowed society, the culture around them, to begin infiltrating into the church. And it became a me first mentality. What's best for me is most important. But that's nothing new, right? I mean, go back to the very beginning in Genesis. was the very first lie that Satan told Eve that God deceived her to eat the fruit. It was, God's holding out on you. He doesn't really want you to experience this. And so Eve, the very first lie, and there's a sin of selfishness. I want to be like God. And Adam the same. And then their kids, right? Cain killed Abel. Why? Selfishness. Self-motivated life. Me first. I'm the most important. And I don't think that if we fast forward through all of time up until from the creation to us, I don't think that as we look around that we can say we're doing much better, right? In the world of my opinion matters most, and I should just be able to say it out loud as much as I want. Everything in life we kind of turn around to, how does this benefit me? How does it benefit the bottom line? How does this serve and function? How does this affect me the most, right? We live in kind of a self-centered, me-first culture that says, I am more important. And then we bump into 1 Corinthians 13 where it says love means putting others first. Love is others first. As you navigate and think about even your own life, I think it's important, right? If we're going to address issues in our lives, we have to first kind of have a honest dialogue with ourselves. And I'm just curious, as you have an honest dialogue with yourself, how much of what you do is motivated by me first? What affects me? Self-centered selfishness, right? And if it doesn't affect me or doesn't benefit me or doesn't put me at the center of it, I don't know if I really want to do it. And that's what everything in our world kind of points us towards. But we realize that, and what Paul is going to say here, and what Jesus shows us throughout the Gospels is this: selfishness, self-centeredness is directly opposed to love. It's the opposite of what love really is. As I've spent years working with students in ministry, I spent years now in different counseling sessions and counseling not only students but now adults, and done premarital counseling and done marital counseling and sat with other folks as they're going through hard things and tried to be part of mediations where we reconcile things. You know what I've noticed throughout all of those things? What kills relationships more than almost anything else is selfishness. You want to submarine your marriage faster than anything else? Make it all about you. And you will submarine your relationships. You will submarine your marriage. You'll submarine your friendships faster than anything else. Is this me first? I like how Rick Warren put it. Selfishness is poison to relationships. So when you and I are focused on me and I, what we're telling the world is that we, even if we say we claim to love them, if we are focused only on me and I, our words are pretty empty because we're really not showing love. Paul says it this way in Philippians chapter 2. He says, do nothing. I just noticed that. That's pretty all-encompassing. That whole nothing thing. You know, when he says no thing, that's what nothing is. Do no thing from selfish ambition or conceit. Wow, that's challenging, right? Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. But in humility, what? Count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. And then what Paul does next in Philippians chapter 2 is he just points people to Jesus, right? He says, look at Jesus. Look at how he navigated through life. Look how he navigated through and loved very selflessly. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at Jesus this morning. Matthew chapter 14, if you want to turn your Bibles there. or they'll be on the in your notes as well, in your bulletin or on the app. But Jesus here is in ministry, and normally I set up the passage, but the passage just kind of sets up itself. So in Matthew chapter 14, I'm going to read the first 12 verses as the context for where we're going to head in this. At this time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. That is why the miracle and power is at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It's not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." The king was sorry, but because of his oath and his guests, he commanded to be given. And he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl. And she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it. And they went and told Jesus. So what's happening here? Herod the Great attempted to kill Jesus when he was just a boy, and now Herod Tetrarch, was jealous. He was very self-centered in all of his, and he was afraid of the fame of Jesus, and so and he just didn't really like that this guy John the Baptist was talking about him and his own things. See, Herod, if you didn't catch it in there, Herod the Tetrarch, he had taken his brother Philip's wife, and it's like, no, I want her. And so he married and stole basically his brother's wife, his sister-in-law, for himself. And John the Baptist said that he had gone around and he was very vocal, and he's like, no, that's messed up, dude. You can't do that, right? That's not okay. Right? You can't be doing that. That's sinful. That's lawful. And here's the deal. The Jewish people thought of Herod as the king of the Jews. And he's like, listen, if you're going to be the king of the Jewish people, the king of the Jewish religion, essentially, you can't be sinning like this. You are held to a different standard. You can't be doing this. And so he arrested John, but he kind of liked John because John would tell him things that nobody else would. You know how everybody, like especially to the king or somebody in power, people tend to come around. Little minions come around and they are always just yes, 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 yes. And John the Baptist wasn't that, and so he would tell Herod the truth. And so there was kind of a strange relationship where Herod kind of hated John the Baptist, but at the same time respected and loved him on a weird kind of sense because John was a truth teller. And and not only did he kind of like John, but he also feared the people because the people loved John the Baptist. John the Baptist, you remember, is the cousin of Jesus. He was the one that came and was telling people before Jesus ever entered the scene, listen, somebody's coming, this Messiah is coming, this great one's coming. And so the people loved John. He was a great prophet. But he's in prison. And Herodias, Herod's wife, and sister-in-law at the same time. It was a weird situation. Really hated John. What's worse is that there was this big party taking place, and his niece slash stepdaughter danced in a provocative way that pleased everybody, and so he promised to give her whatever else, and so this girl went to her mother, and her mother said, give me John the Baptist's head on a platter. So he did that. Did you notice the last verse? And this is just a setup to this passage. Did you notice this verse? And his disciples came after John the Baptist, the great John the Baptist, had been killed, and took his body and buried it. And they went and told Jesus. They traveled a great distance, a long distance to get to where Jesus was at. Now, think about this, right? Somebody dies today, and we hear about it kind of instantly, within a few hours, right? In fact, doesn't it seem like to you, I don't know if your phone does this like mine, I don't know why this is happening, but like my phone, like the news, they think that I need to know about everybody that was even semi-famous when they died. Do you know that? Notice that? Like, I don't ever remember this happening before, but like daily, I'm getting like a notification from some news network. It says this person died at 80 years old. This person died at 70 years old. This person died. And I'm like, instantly we know about, if somebody important, if somebody as great as John the Baptist died today, we would know about it in about 2 hours or less, right? Because it'd be all over news, it'd be all over social media, it would be all over this. He died. It would have taken a couple days for John's disciples to run to where Jesus is currently at and tell him. Where Jesus was at was he was out teaching. He was out performing miracles. He was out doing ministry. He had just sent his disciples out in pairs to evangelize. There's a lot going on in Jesus' ministry. Could you imagine, though, how Jesus received this news? His own cousin, right? His cousin, the one that prepared the way for him. The one that leapt in the womb of his mother when Jesus in his mother's womb came in the same vicinity because they had a soul connection to that level. And Jesus, these disciples of John come running up. Say, Jesus, I don't know how to tell you this, but John's dead. Imagine how you would feel in this moment, the depth of sorrow that you would be in, and Jesus is there. What would you want in that moment? You and I would probably want some time alone. We'd probably want less to do, right? We'd want some time to grieve. We'd want all those things, a quiet place to remember. And that's what Jesus appears to be looking for. In verse 13, it says, now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. Like any of us would, he lost his cousin, the foreteller of him in a terrible way, and he just wants to be alone. But that's not where verse 13 ends. Verse 13 ends with this, but when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And we're not talking about like a few people, a group of 25, a group of 50. 5,000 men, not counting women and children, so probably 10,000 people see that Jesus had gone by boat across, and they're like, oh, and they all start coming. And they gather together. And now Jesus, wanting to be alone, wanting to grieve, wanting to be with just the disciples so that they can process through what the news they just heard. And now a group of 10,000 people are standing there. What would you have done? Well, we see what Jesus does. Because Jesus is love, and love by definition, Jesus is by definition love because God is love. And love, like what Paul tells us, is not self-seeking and puts others first. So we see what Jesus does. He doesn't get angry or frustrated or impatient or annoyed like I would have. Right? When I'm inconvenienced, when I had a plan, when I have a plan to go do something and something bumps into that plan and interrupts that plan, I tend to get irritated, annoyed, right? Angry even, frustrated. Here's what we see Jesus do. Verse 14. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. He had compassion on them. N.T. Wright says it this way: Jesus translated his sorrow over John and perhaps his sorrow over himself into sorrow for them. Jesus transformed his own feelings into love for those It's why Paul in 1 Corinthians, the whole lead up, he says, listen, if you could speak in the voice of men or angels, but have nothing, or have not love, you're nothing. If you have all the prophetic powers or knowledge, or even sacrifice your own bodies, but with love, you're nothing. And so Jesus does what Jesus does because Jesus is love. He sees people and he sees them through the eyes of compassion. And this is not the only place we see this, Jesus doing this. Other places in Scripture, it says when Jesus looked up and he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without shepherds. Jesus saw through the lens of compassion and even into his heart sorrow for people who were hurting and lost. And so then Jesus teaches them and he heals their sick. He spends all day with this crowd of 10,000 people doing what Jesus does, loving the way Jesus loves, putting their needs ahead of their own. And then the disciples, after this, I'm sure they were just doing their best, but they were exhausted as well. We know for at least 3 or 4 of the Jesus' disciples were, before they were Jesus' disciples, they were disciples of John the Baptist. They had devoted their lives to John. So they were just finding out too that their beloved, the person that they followed before they followed Jesus, had died. They were dealing with sorrow. And Jesus was leading the way and putting others first, but they were following. But eventually the night rolls around. And he says this, it says, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, Jesus, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go in the village and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." And they said, "We only have 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up in heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men beside women and children. I would love to have been sitting there that day. How about you? Can you just imagine, like in your mind's eye, just imagine seeing Jesus care for others? It must have been special, right? Seeing the way that he loved, seeing the way that he would look at people, seeing the way that he was so gentle with lost and broken people who were in need of healing, and he was doing his thing. And the disciples, I think they were coming along with it, but eventually, like probably you and I, right, our suggestion would be similar. Hey, Jesus, it's been a long day. We came here to grieve. We came here to be by ourselves. Send them away. Like, they need to go find food. We need food. We need food. We need it. And Jesus says this, hey, you give them something to eat. And they're like, what in the world? Jesus, do you know, like, to feed this many people, we know from other gospels, they kind of push back. They're like, do you know how much it would cost to feed this many people? You know, they're like counting that, like, hey, we don't have that, Jesus, right? We're short on resources. Here's all we have. 5 loaves, 2 fish. That's it. That's enough for maybe 2 of us. That's not even enough for the 12 of us plus you, Jesus. Like, this is enough for a little boy's lunch, essentially. So this is all that's here. And Jesus takes that, and we see him do something special with that. And I find myself there too. When I try to think about sometimes living others first, like my mentality towards putting others first, my mentality is a lot like the disciples. Jesus, I don't have a lot. I mean, I don't have a lot of time. I don't have a lot of extra time, Jesus. So you're talking to me about putting others first. You want me to live others first. Listen, I barely have any time for anything. I only have 5 loaves and 2 fish worth of time, Jesus. What could I possibly do for other people? Jesus, I don't have, like, we talk about putting others first and loving people and loving people in a big way. And Jesus, when I look at my own resources and the things I have to give to live others first, I only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's all I got. I mean, I'm looking at the finances and it's not there. And I would love to live generously and I would love to help others and I would love to live others first, but all I have is this. And so because of that, like the disciples, my temptation is to be like, I only have this, so we can't do anything, right? I only have this much time. I have barely, so I can't do anything. So I just won't. Or I only have this much money, or I only have this much resources, or I have this much talent, or I only have this, whatever it is that we bring to Jesus. So I can't really live others first because all I have is this, and I need this for me, or else we're not going to survive. And I love what Jesus does. He says, I'll take that. I'll take whatever you got. I'll take the 5 loaves and 2 fish. I'll take the little time you have. I'll take the little resource that you feel like you have. Bring it to me. And what do we see Jesus do? He blesses it. And he just keeps tearing off pieces. Wouldn't you love to have seen this? Like, we think about this as a kid's story and a Sunday school story that Jesus feeds 5,000, or it's really 10,000 people. And we're like, oh, okay, that's a cute little story. Could you imagine sitting there, right? Andrew bringing these things to Jesus saying, here you go. And then Jesus just keep passing it out and keep passing it out. Jesus is blowing people's minds as he just continues, and as he continues to pull off, more just seems to be appearing. And the disciples brought what they had, all that they had, which was very little. And because of, through Jesus, there's 12 basketfuls left over. Jesus can take our time, whatever time we have, our talent, our energy, our resources, our money, and put in his hands. When we trust it to him and say, here's what I got. I'll use it, Jesus, to live others first. I'll use it for your glory and for your kingdom. He'll take that and multiply it. And make it work. What Jesus was doing with what was given to him was so powerful and miraculous, it's hard to even imagine. But Jesus just shows us what it looks like to live out others first. And then Jesus gets to what we normally get to first, right? So Jesus, remember the whole context of the story, right? He hears about his cousin dying. He wants to be alone. So he goes off to be by himself. The crowds show up. So he's like, okay, I have compassion for these people. And so he serves them all day long. He pours himself out all day long. He takes the disciples along with him, multiplies resources. But then he doesn't forget what he initially needed. So it says this, verse 22, immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go before him to the other side. Well, he dismissed the crowds, and after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. So Jesus serves all day, but then after he had put others first, then he says, okay, you guys go ahead and go back home. Now that I've fed you, now that I've taken care of you, disciples, you go ahead and go. And then he goes up by himself in a desolate place to pray, to grieve, to recharge. So what I don't want us to hear from this message is that there's never a time to get away and rest. There's never a time that you should grieve or that you should be by yourself or you should get alone with the Lord or you should take time to be with your family. And I don't want you to hear that there's never a time for that, because that's not what Jesus shows, right? On two ends of the pendulum, we have these two things. And normally, right, this is how we live. There's like, we kind of pendulum swing, right? And so on one end of the pendulum, it's become very popular right now, is this ultra self-care, right? Ultra self-care, where it's all about you and you just take care of yourself. And if anything, we just do you, right? And you do whatever makes you feel good. And if anything else doesn't make you feel good, if anybody infringes on kind of what makes you feel good or you feel alive or what brings your soul joy, then you just dismiss them away because you need self-care, right? It's very popular, self-care. On the other end of the spectrum, right, we have people who are always going and going and going and wringing themselves out for others over and over and over. And there's no moments for them to recharge. There's no moments for them to be alone with the Lord. They're doing for God apart from being with God. And they're running into exhaustion. And so that's the other end of the spectrum, right? Ultra self-care and wringing ourselves out dry. And like with most things, and like the Jesus way, is that the true gold is found in the middle, right? The principle is found in the middle. We see what Jesus does. He lives others first because love is others first. It's not self-seeking. It's not me all the time at the expense of others. Love is others first. And then we see Jesus getting alone by himself, grieving, praying, recharging, refueling, so that he can go out and be others first again. And then getting alone. And we see Jesus in this pattern throughout all of the Gospels, is that he would find time to be alone so that he could go out and be others first again. And then find time to be alone and then go out so he can be others first again. So how do we find that balance? How do we live in that space? I ran across, and this is nothing new and nothing original to me, but this acronym of JOY. If we want joy in life, that's Jesus, others, you, right? The order of how we live our lives. We give Jesus our time. We give time alone with Jesus. We refuel and recharge in the presence of Jesus so that we can go out and be about others. And then with what's left, we have time for us, right? Jesus, others, you. And this is a choice, right? This is choosing to love others above yourself. And guess what? You have it in you to do. You really do. Because you know how to do it in some realms, at least most of us. Right? Because when you become a parent, especially you moms, you don't get a choice. You are thrust right into others first, right? Because at some point in the middle of the night, very early on when you become a mother, like the first night after you give birth, right? That baby starts screaming and interrupts your sleep schedule. And they ain't gonna stop until you put them first. Isn't that what, moms, isn't that what it's like mothering is about? You learn to put your kids' needs there. Dads, you too. Because when you wake up to the horrifying sound of your child puking in their bed, it's haunting. You guys all, if you know, you know. Then you know what it looks like to live others first. Because you drag yourself out of bed and you go meet the horror that's awaiting you, right? And most of what parenting is, especially at a very young age, is learning how to put others first, put your kids' needs ahead of your own. So If you're a parent, you've done that. That's not just for parenting when they're little kids. That's for all of life with people that you love, like your kids and like your spouse, with your friends, but it's also for people. Jesus did this for people that would one day stand there and yell, "Crucify him." That's what I love what Dr. Tony Evans says. Biblical love is a choice to do good for another person regardless of what we feel. It is a decision to compassionately and righteously pursue the betterment of another person. This is why you can even love your enemies according to Christ's commands, because love is a choice to put other people first. Jesus, others, you. And friends, that is what love looks like. Again, we got to come back in this series to recognize if you want to say, "I love you" to somebody, that is what love looks like. Love looks like being patient and kind and not envious or boastful or proud or rude or self-seeking. That's not what love is. And so if you say, "I love you" to somebody, yet you are those things, you do not love them. You might as well not say it, because you're talking about something else, but it's not love. Because Jesus says, God says, if you want to actually love somebody, it looks different. And one of the things it looks like is that you are willing to put them before you, like Jesus did, over and over and over. And this, obviously, the feeding of the 5,000, it's one of the examples of many examples in the Gospels of Jesus putting others first, including the ultimate, right, on the cross. But we'll talk about that in another week.